president's car passed the knoll on which the assassin apparently was situated, hit the ground the moment the shot was fired, in fear that they themselves would be hit by the bullets. Bill Newman said that he did not see who might have fired, and he did not know of anyone in the vicinity who had fired. Pierce Allman was on the streets of downtown Dallas as the motorcade passed through, and you heard shots, did you not?
It happened pretty much in front of me, John. I didn't know that the president was dead until I came back to the newsroom. They wouldn't let us out of the Texas School Book Depository building. As the president turned the corner, we were standing there and broke into applause. As he came around, it's funny because we were remarking among ourselves. Terry Ford of Radio Promotion was with me, and we were looking up at the open windows of the Texas School Book Depository building and at all that open space and wondering just how in the world they had already covered all this and wondering where the Secret Service men were. And right after Mr. Kennedy passed in front of me, I heard one big explosion, and my immediate thought was, like I think most of the people standing around there, this is firecrackers, but it's a pretty poor taste. I looked and saw the president, I thought, duck. Evidently he was slumping at the time. The car immediately sped on. No one seemed galvanized into immediate action. The shots didn't seem rapid at all. They were three well-spaced, reverberating shots.
How far were you from the car, Pierce, when the shots were fired?
The car was in the middle of the street, and I was on the left-hand side of the street, I'd say about 10 feet.
And it didn't stop?
No, the car kept going. The car did not stop. The policeman immediately came over and said, all right, hit the dirt. And everyone concerned scrambled right away, including this young man, the young man with the two children, Bill Newman, whom I talked to right after it happened. I, like 5 or 6 rather foolish other people, immediately ran up the knoll over there by the viaduct and looked over the fence. We saw nobody except a lot of people running around. And then I headed into the Texas School Book Depository where they were beginning to search. And
well, did you think at that time that the assassin had fired from the building?
Yes, I think this was the consensus at the time, although now I notice Mr. Newman says he thought the shots were fired from a knoll.
No, I see.
I think the logical place to have fired them would have been from the building, and then when I left a few minutes ago, they were still searching. I think the general reaction of the people over there as I left was, it just can't be.
We have this report just received in the 57 radio newsroom that Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the Dallas hospital where President Kennedy died. Johnson was accompanied by his wife. Newsmen had no opportunity to question him. This report was issued at 1:48, which was just moments ago, and apparently squelches the rumor that the Vice President's physical condition was not in good shape. Apparently he is, because the Associated Press reports now that Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left Parkland Hospital, where President Kennedy died, accompanied by his wife, Lady Bird, and he spoke to no one as he left. Pierce, how many shots did you hear? You heard 3 shots.
I heard 3 well-spaced shots.
Do you think that the shots were returned? Could it be that the assassin fired 1 or 2 shots and possibly one was fired in return, or do you think that all 3 came from the same gun?
This is possible. However, the 3 I heard a boom, and then a space, and then another boom, and it was not until after the third distinct sound, this third boom, that police were able to draw their revolvers and start firing in return. And of course, it was when they actually were reluctant to fire. I imagine there were a few shots exchanged. I don't remember, frankly, but they were reluctant probably because of all the crowds around. Everyone suddenly popped out with guns and told the public to hug the ground for safety's sake.
Roger, ready.
John, we just received word from Ron Ryland in the mobile unit that police have a suspect. They picked him up in the Texas Theater. He has a gun. They are taking him to the main station now.
And we call in now Ron Ryland for a report from WFAA's mobile unit on that.
Dallas police have taken into custody a white male found in the Texas Theater. The man is believed to be a suspect in the recent shooting of a police officer at 10th and Crawford in Oak Cliff. A witness at the scene of the killing said that the police officer talked briefly with the young man, and the young man then shot the police officer twice through the head. After a furious search up and down Jefferson Avenue, The officers finally found the suspect that they have taken into custody in the Jefferson Theater, armed with a weapon. He is now en route to the Central Police Station. From the scene, this is Vic Robertson reporting for WFAA News.
Well, apparently the assassin has been apprehended. We have no official confirmation of that, but apparently he was the one. We call in now Walter Evans in WFAA News Cruiser.
Reporting once again from Parkland Hospital, we've just been told that rumors which circulated earlier that Vice President Johnson had also been shot are erroneous. The Vice President was not injured, nor had he had a heart attack, as had been reported from some sources. About 30 minutes ago, Vice President Johnson was taken from Parkland Hospital. One bystander said he looked ashen when he was taken away, which is understandable. He has been taken to some undisclosed location by Dallas area Secret Service personnel. There has been no announcement as to when he will be sworn in as President of the United States. That announcement is expected sometime later this afternoon. But repeating once again, reports that Vice President Johnson had been shot, as well as Governor Connally and President Kennedy, those reports were erroneous, nor has he had a heart attack. He apparently is in good condition, although in something of a state of shock because of what has happened here in Dallas this afternoon. He's been taken to some undisclosed location here in Dallas, undisclosed for obvious security reasons. When he will make another appearance is not known at this time. We'll have further reports from Parkland Hospital when details develop. From the scene, Walter Evans reporting for Radio 57 News.
And that clears up one rumor that had been floating about, that Vice President Lyndon Johnson was also in critical condition from an unknown cause. There had been reports that he was wounded in the shooting, which is apparently not correct, and there had also been reports that he had suffered possibly a heart seizure, and that apparently is not true, because the Vice President has now left Parkland Hospital, the hospital in which President John F. Kennedy, the 36th President of the United States, died. President Kennedy was shot to death by a hidden assassin armed with a high-powered rifle. Mr. Kennedy, 46 years of age, lived about an hour after a sniper cut him down as his limousine left downtown Dallas. Automatically, the mantle of the presidency falls to the shoulders of Vice President Lyndon Johnson, a native Texan, who had been riding in the same motorcade, 2 cars behind the chief executive. There, of course, is no immediate word as yet on when Vice President Johnson will take the oath of office as president. Mr. Kennedy died at Parkland Hospital, where his bullet-pierced body had been taken in a frantic but futile effort to save his life. Lying wounded at the same hospital is Texas Governor John Connally, who was cut down by the same fusillade that ended the life of the youngest man ever elected to the presidency. Governor Connally and his wife had been riding with the President and Mrs. Kennedy. The First Lady cradled her dying husband's head in her arms as the presidential limousine raced to the hospital. She kept crying, "Oh no." Connally slumped in his seat beside the President. Police ordered an unprecedented dragnet of the city, and as you heard moments ago from Vic Robertson, WFAA newsman, apparently they have apprehended the man they believe to be the assassin. Official confirmation of that, of course, has not as yet been made, but a man was captured, a young man, according to Vic Robertson, after a chase on Jefferson Avenue. Full details of that report escaped me, but as much as I could hear of it a moment ago, police were trying to barricade Jefferson in attempts to apprehend a young man who shot an arresting officer. He was finally located in the Jefferson Theater, or a theater on Jefferson Street. The murder weapon has been reported to be a .30-30 rifle. For a further report from Vic Robertson, we switch now to WFAA News Cruiser.
The man that the police have in custody and on the way to the Central Police Headquarters is the man who is believed to have shot police officer J.D. Phipps at Kent and Crawford for no explained reason. As of this time, there is no indication from Oak that there is any further leads as to the man who assassinated President Kennedy. The man was found in the next to last row of the Texas Theater, still armed with a weapon. As he was dragged out to a waiting police car, he was yelling, "I protest this police brutality." The police officers hurried him away from a crowd that was ready to leap on the man, and then he was carried away downtown. No further information is immediately available. This is Vic Robertson reporting for Radio 57 News.
There were reports earlier that a dragnet had been thrown out about the Trade Mart in the industrial section of Dallas. Those efforts apparently were futile. No one has as yet reported that anyone has been apprehended or any suspect cited in that area of town. We will, of course, have further reports from Walter Evans, who is stationed at Parkland Hospital on the condition of Governor John Connally. The whereabouts of Vice President Lyndon Johnson are unknown. He left Parkland Hospital and is at secret hideaway now under heavy guard, I'm sure, by Secret Service. And when he will be sworn in as president is not known at this time. Newsmen had no opportunity to question him as he left Parkland Hospital. Shortly before the president's death, 2 priests were summoned to the emergency ward of Parkland Hospital. They administered the last rites of the church. We spoke earlier in the afternoon with a young man named Bill Newman, who was an eyewitness to the shooting. Of course, as eyewitness accounts often do, they sometimes disagree. Young Bill Newman was under the impression that the presidential car stopped when the shots were fired, and that momentarily it resumed its course as it took the president to Parkland Hospital. Pierce Allman of the WFAA staff was in the same vicinity, and he said it was his impression that the motor car sped onward without stopping. Governor John Connally was shot in the back, slightly below the shoulder blade. The president was shot in the head. There obviously were 3 shots fired from a grassy knoll by the assassin, who was situated, one estimate placed him as close as 60 feet to the street. 2 of the shots struck home. Where the 3rd one hit, we have as yet no report. Neither President Kennedy nor Governor Connally were reported to have received 2 bullet wounds, so that leaves unaccounted for the 3rd bullet that was fired from what has been described, and from what source we know not, a .30 caliber rifle. Now, Vic Robertson may have information on that, because the young man who was captured in the theater on Jefferson reportedly still had a weapon with him. How the fact could be determined that it was a .30 rifle from bullet wounds is not apparent at this time. A .30 caliber rifle possibly, but as to whether or not it could have been classified specifically as a .30, we are not sure at this time. 6 members of President Kennedy's cabinet were out of the country when the shooting occurred, flying to Japan. An hour and a half out of Honolulu, the secretaries, all members of the president's cabinet, were advised of the killing, and immediately their plane turned back. They were expected to speed back to Washington. The party was on its way to a meeting with members of the Japanese cabinet. In the party were Secretary of State Rust, Secretary of Commerce Hodges, Secretary of Labor Wirtz, Secretary of Interior Udall, and Secretary of Agriculture Freeman, all with their wives. Here's further information on Texas Governor John Connally. He has undergone an operation for a gunshot wound in the chest. His condition is said to be serious. He underwent surgery at 1:30 p.m., and although Connally was described as being not out of the woods, his doctors said that his vital signs are good. So apparently he is in serious condition, but does his doctor say his vital signs are good? Just exactly what the vital signs consist of, we are not sure of. Perhaps that means something to you. 3 of America's last 4 presidents have faced bullets of an assassin. The nation's 34 presidents have been, of the nation's 34 presidents, 3 of them have been slain in office. On November 1st, 1950, 2 Puerto Ricans tried to shoot their way into Blair House. They crossed from the White House where President Harry Truman was then staying. 1 gunman was killed. The other is serving a life term. On February 15th, 1933, anarchist Joseph Zangara shot at President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt in Miami. The bullet missed Roosevelt, but fatally wounded Mayor Anton Cermak of Chicago. Today came the shots at President Kennedy, and of the last 4 men to be elected to the White House, only Dwight D. Eisenhower saw no attempt on his life. The presidents killed by an assassin were Abraham Lincoln, James A. Garfield, William McKinley, and now John F. Kennedy.
John, in that connection, it's interesting to note that since the year 1800, every president for 20 years has died in office. And there was some talk about John Kennedy, when elected in 1960, being hale, hearty, young, very healthy, would probably break this tradition. But because of what's happened today in Dallas, the tradition seems to go on.
We're pausing briefly for station identification. We'll return to reports from the 57 Radio Newsroom momentarily.
This is Radio 57, WFAA 570 AM and FM, from Dallas, Texas. The President and Texas Governor John Connally, as you know, were cut down by assassins' bullets as they toured downtown Dallas in an ominous open car. Mrs. Kennedy, again repeating, was not hurt. Mrs. Connally also was safe. Witnesses said there were 3 loud bursts of gunfire. According to WFAA program director, who was an eyewitness at the scene, Pierce Allman, there were 3 reverberating, well-spaced shots. This is the first president to be slain. While in office, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and now John F. Kennedy. At first, it was impossible to tell whether the president was hit, but the governor plainly had visible wounds in his chest, indicating the shots came from an automatic weapon, from that Knoll or Texas School Book Depository building on Elm Street. At first, Secret Service agents had thought the shots came from an automatic weapon. Turn now back to Radio 57 News to see if there are any late developments, and here's John Allen.
Ben, this is Roger Reddy. John has stepped out to find out some further information. We have heard just now, a little earlier, we had a report that there was a fellow apprehended at the downtown Dallas theater by the police, and that he had a gun with him, and he was suspected to be the assassin. He was immediately rushed into the police cruiser. He had been apprehended in the Texas theater, in the next to the last row of seats, and he was apprehended by the police, put into the cruiser, and rushed immediately downtown to the jail. We have heard, this is still unofficial, that this person had a shotgun with him, and therefore this would indicate that perhaps he is not the one who shot President Kennedy, since apparently the president was shot with an automatic rifle weapon. Governor Connally is still in serious condition with his gunshot wound in the chest. The hospital says his condition, quote, is serious. He said that the governor was not out of the woods, the spokesman at the hospital. His doctor said, however, the vital signs were good, as John Allen just told you. The vital signs apparently indicated from pulse, a heartbeat, etc. He was shot in the chest, which, of course, is always a serious place to get shot. The doctor at the hospital confirms that Connally had a good pulse and that his respiration was satisfactory.
Have you received any further information from Rick Robertson or Walter Evans in the last few moments?
Walter Evans now has a report from the hospital.
I have had a momentary break from the microphone and had not heard what Roger Reddy was saying. We switch now for a late report from Parkland Hospital to Walter Evans in the WFAA News Cruiser.
We have just come from a news conference held by Julian Reed, an administrative assistant to Governor John Connally. He had, right before he started his news conference, he had a conversation with Mrs. Connally, who, of course, was right in the thick of what went on in downtown Dallas this afternoon. Let's reconstruct briefly what happened. It was about 12:15 this afternoon. The car carrying President and Mrs. Kennedy, Governor and Mrs. Connally, and 2 Secret Service agents, an open car, had rounded the corner of Main and Houston Streets, had proceeded 1 block north up Houston Street, and had turned to the left on Elm Street, and was getting ready to go under the triple underpass. At that moment, Mrs. Connally said she heard a shot. Instantly, when she heard the shot, her husband turned to see what had happened, and at that instant, he too was shot. Mrs. Connally says she believes the first shot was the one that struck President Kennedy in the head. There was a second shot. That shot struck Governor Connally in the back and coming out of his body in the right chest. There are reports of a third shot, and Governor Connally has a wound on his wrist, and that could be the result of that third pistol shot, although Mrs. Connally is not certain whether there was a third shot or not. She said immediately after the first shot, Mrs. Kennedy grabbed her husband. After the second shot, Mrs. Connally grabbed her husband. All four of them ducked down into the car to escape any further fusillade of shots. And within a split second, one of the two Secret Service men in the front seat of the car grabbed the telephone, said, "Let's go to the hospital," and then he proceeded to make a call, presumably to other Secret Service men in the area, or perhaps the hospital. At any rate, the car was sped rapidly down Stemmons Freeway, both women holding their husbands in their arms, and was here at Parkland Hospital within a matter of 5 to 10 minutes. So that's the situation. There is still no official word as to when Vice President Johnson will be sworn in as President of the United States. About an hour ago, he was whisked away from Parkland Hospital in something of a state of shock himself, although he was not shot, as had been previously reported, nor had he had a heart attack. There had been rumors that he had had a heart attack. None of those rumors were true. He apparently is in good condition under the circumstances. He's been taken to some unknown location, and that location will be kept secret for obvious security reasons. The press room here at Parkland Hospital, which was set up within a matter of minutes by Parkland Hospital officials on the first floor of the building, is in something of a state of shock at this moment. Just now, reporters are beginning to realize what had happened. They acted on reflex right at first and continued to act so for the next hour or so, but by now a kind of state of shock is beginning to set in. WFAA-TV newsman Mal Couch has just come to the mobile news unit. Mal, what's the situation?
Well, we're not sure right now, Walt. It looks like that Mrs. Kennedy may still be here and may be in a state of shock. Of course, there are many rumors that are floating around. It's also believed that part of Governor John Connally's family has arrived, possibly one of his sons. At this point, this is all that I know from the emergency exit of Parkland. However, Walt, I could tell an interesting story of what happened, because I was within 50 to 75 feet behind the president.
Go ahead.
We had just turned the corner, the motorcade had just turned the corner at, I believe it's Young and Elm. Is this correct?
Elm in Houston.
Elm in Houston, I'm sorry. Overlooking the street is a large building by the name of
The Texas School Book Depository.
the Texas School Book Depository, right. Just as the president's car turned the corner, I heard a loud shot that sounded like, at first, a backfire. And then I heard another one. And then, finally, a third shot. We naturally took this third shot as a rifle shot, because we figured by the third shot that this was not a backfire. It was not a motorcycle backfiring, but it was actually someone taking a crack at the president. Just as our car rounded the corner, we saw the president's car speed off. I had my camera in my hand and raised it and to see an officer fall and pull his pistol. I took a shot of that, and then to my right, two ladies fell to the ground, and one of them had fainted. People were running hither and there, hither and yon. Up in the window, I could not tell what the person looked like, but I saw the rifle being pulled back into the window. This was the 5th or 6th floor. There were people underneath the rifle who looked up to see where the shots had come from. One man started running down the street with his little boy, his little child, and several policemen began running after him, thinking that he was the man that had fired the shots. However, he turned out not to be. There was much confusion around there. I noticed on the sidewalk, Walt, some blood. At this time, I don't know whose blood it was, but there was some blood on the sidewalk away from the street. It must not have been the president's blood. The motorcade then sped off and I was left in mass confusion to try to grope my way out to Parkland Hospital.
Thank you very much, Mel, for that eyewitness report. Ironically, within just a matter of seconds before these fatal shots were fired, Mrs. Connally commented to President Kennedy, you certainly can't say that Dallas is an unfriendly city, because they were beaming over the outstanding reception they had received, not only in downtown Dallas, but all along the way. Just a matter of seconds after that, the first shot was fired, which struck President Kennedy in the head, and the shot which eventually resulted in his death here at Parkland Hospital. We're going to return now to the press room set up here in the first floor of Parkland Hospital, and we'll be bringing you further details as they are released by the White House News Department. We've said this 2 or 3 times in our previous reports. Let us say it once again. There is something of a crowd gathering here at Parkland Hospital, although it looks like it's not quite as great as it was a while ago. Let us please ask you to stay away from Parkland Hospital. Your presence here can only hamper the Dallas policemen in trying to do their job, protecting the people here and trying to control traffic. So please, don't drive to Parkland Hospital. You won't find out anything any quicker here than you will in your own automobile in another part of the city or at home. This is Walter Evans reporting from Parkland Hospital.
We have had WFAA newsmen scattered about the city from the moment the president's plane touched down along the route of the motorcade at Dallas Love Field and to various points in the city. One of those newsmen, Ron Ryland, was an eyewitness to something that happened on West Jefferson. Would you give us a report on that, Ron?
To Washington in just a few minutes, and we...
Months ago, several hundred officers swarmed through every entrance in the theater and found this man sitting in the second row from the back. He was armed with a shotgun. The officers jumped him, wrestled the gun away from him, and then pulled him out through the doors with him screaming, "I protest this police brutality." He was really fighting them all the way, kicking and screaming and hollering until he got to the front entrance of the theater. There was a crowd, I'd say, of 2,000 or 3,000 people had been attracted to the theater by all of the screaming sirens and people descending on the area. And as they pulled the man out through the theater, the officers threw a cordon around him. The people stomped the cordon down. They brushed past the police officer and tried to grab the man, shouting, "Murder him," and all sorts of such things as this, and tried to get to him. And I dare say if they had have gotten to him, that they would have pulled him to pieces. Dallas is in an uproar.
You say that he is armed with a shotgun, or was armed with a shotgun.
That's correct, John.
You didn't hear earlier reports that the president's assassin was armed with a rifle. Had you heard that? Do you think?
Well, there's several things going on around at the moment, John. The idea, of course, is that this man is now fighting for his life. He could be armed with anything.
He had more than one weapon.
The Dallas police officer that was shot down in the line of duty had a pistol. This man was shot. The officer was shot with a pistol.
By a pistol?
We found the pistol later. Yes, a .38 caliber police positive revolver.
There has been a Dallas policeman shot to death, and it's being assumed, although there is no official confirmation, that the same man is responsible. This man that was captured in the theater, have you heard reports that he was the same one? Vic Robertson has been giving us information on that, and he said that there was a terrific search being made and a chase on Jefferson by police in attempts to apprehend a man that they believe is the one they found in the Jefferson Theater. Is that your information?
Well, John, let me put it this way. Dallas is in an uproar. We've got reports of this man in every part of the city. I do believe that this man may be connected. He may have panicked and shot the police officer. The idea, of course, being behind it that right now they're going to grab anybody. It's possible that this man who could have been the same one, he answers a description. He's between 30, 35 years old, short, stocky built, about 5'8". Weighs about 145 to 50 pounds, something on this order. He looks exactly as the description has been broadcast. So at this point, anybody that is armed answering this description could be suspect.
So it is possible that the same man, or maybe he had assistance, but it's possible that the same man fired at the president with a rifle, shot a policeman to death in attempts to apprehend him on West Jefferson, was cornered in the theater, and then used a shotgun in attempts to break away from police even after they had the theater surrounded.
Well, this is quite possible, John, because a man that's this desperate that would go to these lengths to murder the chief executive of the United States probably would go well armed.
Naturally, yes. We agree with that. Thank you very much. Ron Ryland of the WFAA News staff. The president, when he arrived... The president, when he arrived to the greeting of some 5,000 to 6,000 persons. He arrived in Fort Worth. The Christmas lights were on there. Thousands of the lights which lined the downtown Fort Worth buildings were turned on much earlier than usual in a gesture of hello to the president when he arrived in Fort Worth. The chief executive mingled with the crowds there at Carswell Air Force Base and also in front of the Texas Hotel in downtown Fort Worth. And then the president had flown to Dallas late this morning, following a breakfast luncheon in Fort Worth. Thousands were on hand when the president's plane touched down at Love Field. And there followed a motorcade through downtown Dallas. It was almost over. The motorcade through Dallas. To 100 yards. One report says 60 feet, another 100 yards away from the presidential car. The Dallas police had in effect, at the time, the most stringent security arrangements that they have ever attempted here. Police Chief Jess Curry had been warning for several days against just such a possibility. He did not specifically say an assassination, but he said any incident, any untoward incident would be forestalled, if possible, by the Dallas police, and every attempt was being made. It was hoped that there would be no demonstration against the president, like that which occurred when UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was here recently. 6 members of the president's cabinet were flying to Japan when the president was killed this afternoon. They were an hour and a half out of Honolulu. The secretaries were advised of the killing, and they immediately turned back to Washington. They're expected to speed back to Washington today. The party was on the way to a meeting with members of the Japanese cabinet. And in the party were Secretary of State Rusk, Secretary of Commerce Hodges, Secretary of Labor Works, Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall, and of Agriculture Orville Freeman. And each of these members of the president's cabinet had their wives with them. They were informed on the plane that the president had been shot and turned back to this country. Governor John Connally, who was riding in the president's car and was also shot in the chest from behind, just below the shoulder blade, underwent an operation at about 1:30 today at Parkland Hospital. Connally's condition is said to be serious, but the doctors in attendance say that while the governor is not out of the woods, his vital signs are good. WFAA newsman Walter Evans reported moments ago that the governor was wounded in the wrist. So apparently that accounts for all 3 shots that were heard by eyewitnesses to this assassination and attempted assassination. Police Chief H. McGill of Houston had reported that there were 3 telephone threats made against the life of President Kennedy. Of course, these things are made frequently against any president, and usually they are passed off as pranks or cranks, people who are known also as cranks. We have this further information. Police now say that President Kennedy was assassinated by a shot from a warehouse, so that if this has been confirmed, then that rules out the grassy knoll near the street on which the motorcade passed. The entire building has now been evacuated, and Dallas police say that they have found the remains of fried chicken and paper on the 5th floor. They say the sniper apparently had been there for some time. The Secret Service said the assassin apparently used a high-powered Army or Japanese rifle of approximately .25 caliber. They said the rifle had a scope on it. Where this information comes from, we do not know. We earlier had reports it was a .30-30 rifle, but the Dallas police are being quoted now as saying that the rifle was of Japanese make, of high power, and approximately .25 caliber with a scope on it, and remains of fried chicken and a paper have been found on the 5th floor of a warehouse along the presidential route, and from which the bullets apparently were fired. That's the Dallas police with that information. Vice President Johnson's wife, after a check on conditions in the emergency section, has said that her husband was unharmed. There were earlier rumors that the vice president had been hurt or had suffered an attack of some sort, but these rumors have now been cleared up, and he has left the hospital. The whereabouts of the vice president are not known, and when he will be sworn in as president is also a closely guarded secret. He is, I'm sure, under heavy Secret Service guard at this time. Roger Reddy of the WFAA newsroom.
Yes, John, we just got a call from Vic Robertson at the police headquarters here in Dallas, and Vic has told us that a Bureau FBI man has said that the man who was apprehended at the Texas Theater in downtown Dallas with the shotgun apparently is not going to be able to be connected with the direct assassination on President Kennedy, but that he apparently was the one who shot the policeman in a subsequent event in downtown Dallas.
Do they feel that he was connected indirectly?
Vic didn't say. He
no
intimated that apparently this was part of the reaction to the assassination.
They didn't give any indication as to whether they thought there was more than one person involved in the assassination attempt.
No, they didn't, but obviously there is. The man has not been charged yet. He has not been formally charged with anything. They're still holding him, still questioning him. They have nobody else in custody, and Vic says as soon as he finds out later word, he'll give it to us.
Travis Lynn is now in a WFAA mobile unit downtown with a report on the reaction of Dallasites.
Here in downtown Dallas, there is an extra edition of a newspaper out, and it is very abundant on the streets. It says simply, President Dead. The atmosphere in Dallas, which is at this time wind-blown, is one of a crowded street. The streets are jammed with automobiles, and the sidewalks with people who are just standing there. Just standing, occasionally reading a newspaper, talking to one another. One man came up to my car and said, "Have they caught him? Have they caught him?" And he was, of course, referring to the suspect of the assassination, and we were unable to tell him whether or not anyone definitely connected with the assassination has been arrested. I was at the Trade Mart prepared to give a report on the president's speech to some 2,500 people. When the first news that the president had been shot came, it first did not go to the public in general. There at the Trade Mart, the 2,500 luncheon guests were not informed. However, the rumors spread like wildfire through the corridors, and newsmen, about 250 of them, raced out of the building carrying their cameras with them. A long wait ensued in which this rumor began to spread across the crowd itself. Then, some 30 minutes after the president had died, an announcement was made that it is apparent some incident has occurred. We do not know how serious it is. A benediction was said as everyone stood and bowed his head. About 30 minutes passed, and still the people maintained their seats at the Trade Mart, unable to believe that anything had happened to the President of the United States. Finally, the announcement was made that the President had been shot and taken to Parkland Hospital. The announcement that the President was dead was never made at the Trade Mart, but it was obvious from the tone of the man giving the announcement, Dr. Luther Holcomb of the Dallas Council of Churches, that it was a grave situation. Another prayer was said for the country, and then people left the Trade Mart. Perhaps the most typical reaction was that of a Negro porter who was to serve the president. He leaned back against the presidential seal on the rostrum, pulled out his handkerchief, and wailed loudly. Here in downtown Dallas, people are talking to one another, as I say, without expression on their faces. And it's a solemn day in Dallas. This is Travis Lynn in downtown Dallas, now back to Communications Center.
This is Ben Laurie at Master Control at WFAA. Our Washington correspondents have told us of a moment of silent prayer that was called for by the presiding official of the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. And following that moment of silence, the General Assembly at the UN has been adjourned for the rest of the day in mourning for the passing of the assassination of the President of the United States. The body of President Kennedy has been taken from Parkland Hospital. Sources say it will be flown to Washington this afternoon. Mrs. Kennedy left Parkland Emergency Ward by the back door in a slow, deliberate pace, obviously dazed. Sources all around her during the entire ordeal said she was not hysterical at any point during the entire affair. Results in social circles are beginning to be felt around Big D. The scheduled football game between Woodrow Wilson and South Oak Cliff High Schools, scheduled for tonight, has been called off. This game will be rescheduled for Saturday night at 7:30 p.m. at Cobb Stadium. Likewise, the Dallas Morning News Travel Club will not meet tonight as scheduled. And now we turn you back to Radio 57 Newsroom and more details as they come in.
A moment ago, we received reports that a man had been arrested in Fort Worth by police officials or authorities there, possibly some connection with the assassination attempt. That has not been confirmed. Police do say now, however, that President Kennedy was assassinated by a shot fired from a warehouse as the presidential motorcade was nearing the triple underpass at the west section of the downtown Big D area at the intersection of Elm Street and Houston. The entire warehouse has been evacuated, and Dallas police say that they have found the remains of fried chicken and paper on the 5th floor. They say the sniper apparently had been there for some time. WFAA newsman Mal Couch, who was situated in that vicinity, said that he saw a gun of some sort. He did not know for certain what it was, rifle or gun, appear from a window on the 5th or 6th floor. Apparently it was on the 5th floor of the warehouse from which the assassin fired. Police, here is an official confirmation of this report we just gave you. The police have arrested a man in the Riverside section of Fort Worth in the connection with the shooting of a Dallas policeman. However, this man denies any connection with the assassination attempt of President Kennedy. The earlier reports we had were that a man had shot to death a Dallas policeman on West Jefferson. Approximately 20 police squad cars were enlisted in the attempt to capture him, and he was finally located. The man they believed to have been the one who shot the policeman was located in a Jefferson Street theater, and at that time he was armed with a shotgun. So these conflicting reports remain to be verified and straightened out. We now call in Walter Evans, who has an additional report to make from the WFAA News Cruiser.
We don't know for sure because none of the White House staff knows for sure, but probably at this moment, this country has a new president. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was whisked away from Parkland Hospital about 1 o'clock, approximately 1 o'clock, to some secret location, and we've just been told that the purpose of whisking him away was for the purpose of officially swearing him in and making him, without any legal question, the new president of the United States. Just what President Johnson's status is or what his location is at this moment, nobody knows. When we'll find out, we don't know, because the White House authorities who are passing out all of the information here at Parkland Hospital themselves don't know. He apparently had with him when he left at least 2 or more Secret Service men and 1 administrative assistant. They were taken somewhere, probably in the city of Dallas, for the swearing in, but where that is, we don't know. 2 doctors who were in attendance, who attended President Kennedy after he was brought into the emergency room here at Parkland, have just this moment concluded a news conference. They were Dr. Kemp Clark, who is chief of neurosurgery here at Parkland Hospital, and Dr. Malcolm Perry, one of the attending physicians. Dr. Clark told the newsmen that there was at least one wound, perhaps two wounds in the upper portion of President Kennedy's body. There was a wound in the head, which would obviously be the fatal wound. There was perhaps a second wound in the front part of the neck, below the larynx, below the Adam's apple. He says he's not sure at this time whether the neck wound was caused by the same slug that entered the head or not, or whether it was perhaps a second bullet. This is not known at this time. I see our Fort Worth newsman, Fred Hatton, who's on the scene. He's just come running up to the wagon. Fred, what's the situation?
Walter, they are going to swear the vice president in as president at Love Field at this time.
All right, fine, Fred. Thank you very much. Are you going out there now? Yes. Fine. Thank you very much. We've just been told, as you heard, that Vice President Johnson will be sworn in at Love Field within the next few minutes. We'll try to bring you details of that event as they happen. We're on our way there now at this time. So while we get underway here, we will return you to our studios and have further information as it develops. Walter Evans reporting from Parkland Hospital. We're now going to the airport.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson to be sworn in at Love Field as President of the United States. The news of this shooting has hit Congress in Washington like a thunderbolt. Senator Edward Kennedy, the president's youngest brother, was presiding over the Senate when he was told. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had gone home to McLean, Virginia for lunch when the news reached him. And Senate Democratic leader Mike Mansfield had says, "This is terrible. I can't find words to describe how I feel." Speaker John McCormick was visibly shaken. Senate GOP leader Dirksen said this is the most disastrous thing that could hit the nation. The president's mother and father were at Hyannisport, Massachusetts when the word reached them. Mrs. Kennedy is 72. Mr. Kennedy is 75. You'll recall he suffered a stroke in December 1960 and had never fully recovered. Secretary of State Rusk and other cabinet members were aboard a plane bound for Japan. The 6 members of the cabinet had their wives with them when they received the information of the assassination of the president. They had their plane turned back. It was at a point somewhere between Honolulu and Tokyo. Now, from Communications Center, Roger Reddy.
John, here's a statement from Governor John Connally's office in Austin. The statement reads as follows. He is in the operating room. The doctors have opened his chest. He will probably be there 2 more hours and undergo orthopedic surgery. He has probably 4 broken ribs and a contused or bruised lung. A lung was collapsed but has been reinflated. No serious artery damage to the heart. Blood pressure, pulse, still okay. That is the bulletin from the hospital. Lieutenant Governor Preston Smith has termed President Kennedy's assassination the darkest day in history of the great state of Texas. In a statement to newsmen, it was said, "Words are not possible to express my feeling over the barbaric actions which occurred today. This day probably was the darkest day in the history of the great state of Texas. It simply has to be the act of a fanatic with a distorted mind. It is a sad tragedy, leaving millions of Texans and other people in the country and the world sad and shocked that something like this could happen in Texas or America." Smith continued, "As Lieutenant Governor of Texas, I officially extend every sympathy possible to the President's family and to Mrs. Connally. Thank goodness the Governor was not incapacitated." That was the quotation from Lieutenant Governor Preston Smith. Smith said further he has no authority to assume the office of governor unless Connally is incapacitated. He said he will not take any action in that direction unless Connally makes the request. Dr. Malcolm Perry, the attendant surgeon at Parkland Hospital who attended President Kennedy, said when he arrived at the emergency room, quote, "I noticed the president was in critical condition with a wound of the neck and head. When asked if possibly the wounds had been made by 2 bullets, he said he did not know. He said immediate resumptive measures were taken and Dr. Kemp Clark, chief of neurosurgery, was called along with several other members of the staff. They arrived immediately, but at this point the president's condition was critical and moribund." For further news in the WFAA News mobile unit, we now switch to Walter Evans.
We're reporting from Love Field, where in the next few moments, according to all reports, Lyndon Johnson will be sworn in as the new President of the United States. just about 3 minutes ago, Air Force One, traditionally the president's airplane, took off from Love Field, carrying the casket containing the body of the late President of the United States. At the moment, there's something of a rhubarb going on out here at Love Field. Newsmen are trying to get up to near the area where the Vice President is to be sworn in. A large contingent of the White House Corps is there at this time. However, the local newsmen are being kept away from the scene, about 100 yards. So we're going to go back and see what we can do about getting up to the plane, and until that situation resolves, we'll be off the air. So from Love Field, where Lyndon Johnson will soon be sworn in as President of the United States, Walter Evans reporting for Radio 57 News.
And there you have it, the latest report from Love Field. We have had many conflicting reports about people apprehended in Fort Worth and in Dallas. What their connection might be with the assassination is not known, but police are investigating, and I dare say that anyone who matches the description of the assassin, as reported by some who apparently did see him, would be questioned if he's spotted on downtown streets in Dallas this afternoon. News of the president's assassination has been withheld from 98-year-old maternal grandmother of the president in Boston, Mrs. John Fitzgerald, who lives with the son, Thomas Fitzgerald. And he says that he doesn't think he'll ever tell his mother her grandson is dead. Dallas police, as you may have heard, have arrested a 24-year-old man whose name is Lee H. Oswald on West Jefferson. Whether he is the assassin or connected with the assassination attempt in any way has not been determined at this time. However, police are quizzing him to see if he had any possible connection with the slaying. We do not know the name of the man or what authority arrested a person in Fort Worth, but someone in Fort Worth has been apprehended, and a person in Dallas has been apprehended, and police apparently are questioning both of them now. J. Edgar Hoover has ordered a full Federal Bureau investigation, Federal Bureau and FBI investigation here in Dallas, and apparently more than local officials will be involved. Ted Cassidy has just come in with some possible new information.
Here's a bulletin, John, that may have some credence. It's been now issued by 2 wire services. Lyndon Johnson has already been sworn in as President of the United States at about 1:38 today, Central Standard Time. The oath was administered by U.S. District Judge Sarah T. Hughes. We've been waiting for this event to happen. Apparently, it's already taken place.
The United States of America now has a new president. President Lyndon Baines Johnson. President Lyndon Baines Johnson. A Dallas policeman has been shot and killed while chasing the suspected assassin in the West Jefferson area of Dallas. Another officer was with him at the time, and he said the man, when he was apprehended, yelled, "It's all over now," and the two fell struggling into a seat of a theater. The officer's face was slashed, but he managed to arrest the suspect anyway. We were trying to piece together the details, the bits of information that have been filtering into Communication Center here since approximately 12:45 this afternoon. I suppose that's the hour it began. 12:41, I believe, was one of the earliest moments. I remember having heard a mention on the police radio of something that sounded as if it might have great import. I was not aware of what it actually was, but the tone of their voices indicated that something had happened that Dallas police had been striving so hard to prevent. Chief Curry himself, in advance of the president's visit to Dallas, had said that every effort would be made to prevent any untoward incident, anything that might embarrass or harm the president from happening in Dallas. Extra special precautions were being made due to the fact that something embarrassing had happened during the recent visit of UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. But in spite of their efforts, the President John F. Kennedy has been assassinated. Ted Cassidy, you have information?
There's another report. We have so many conflicting reports, you aren't sure which to believe, so you must say that each is an unofficial one until it's officially confirmed by sources from the White House or officially in Washington. But the FBI, it is said by those close to this source of information, have much more information about the assassin and about the shooting than they're willing to divulge at the moment. Travis Lynn and a WFAA mobile news unit is ready with another report.
President Johnson is now President Lyndon Baines Johnson, President of the United States of America. A White House spokesman has just announced that at 2:39 this afternoon, Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes of Dallas swore in Lyndon Johnson as President of the United States. Judge Hughes, who was herself appointed by President John Kennedy, was crying as she performed the ceremony. Vice President Johnson, who was at that time becoming a new president, was in the compartment of the plane, the front part of which carried President Kennedy's body at the time. He squeezed in as many people in the compartment as would fit, and one photographer, the official White House photographer. The ceremony began, and Lyndon Johnson repeated after Judge Sarah T. Hughes the words, "I do solemnly swear that I will perform the duties of the President of the United States to the best of my abilities and defend, protect, and preserve the Constitution of the United States, so help me God." President Lyndon Baines Johnson, President of the United States, is now in the air en route to Washington on Air Force One, the same plane which is carrying the body of former President John Kennedy. From Love Field, this is Travis Lynn reporting for WFAA News.
Governor John Connally, Texas Governor John Connally, has been described as not out of the woods as yet, but his vital signs are good. That was the word given out by doctors at the emergency ward in Parkland Hospital, where Governor John Connally underwent major surgery. His chest was open, and I did not hear the report that came in on the actual operation itself, but as I remember it, he had possibly had as many as 3 or 4 broken ribs, and he is now apparently out of surgery, but is still in very critical condition. He spoke a few words after he arrived at the emergency ward at Parkland. The president's fatal wound was inflicted in the head by the assassin's bullet. We are awaiting further information from all sources, and it filters in gradually from the newsmen we have in the field, from federal and local law enforcement agencies. We had for a time rumors that we did not quote because we had no verification for them, that Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who is now the President of the United States, had suffered a heart seizure. That was not true. Neither was the rumor that he, too, had been wounded. He is now the new President of the United States, sworn in by Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes. Lieutenant Governor Preston Smith has termed President Kennedy's assassination the darkest day in the history of the state of Texas. In a statement to newsmen, he said, "Words are not possible for me to express my feeling over the barbaric actions which occurred today." Smith made this in a prepared statement.
Ladies and gentlemen, our coverage of the president's assassination will continue on 570. This is WFAA 570 AM and FM at Communications Center in Dallas. It's 3 o'clock. This is WFAA 820 AM and FM at Communications Center in Dallas.
And Smith continued, "A Lieutenant Governor of Texas, I officially extend every sympathy possible to the President's family and to Mrs. Connally. Thank goodness the Governor was not incapacitated." Smith said that he has no authority to assume the office of Governor unless Connally is incapacitated. He said he will not take any action in that direction unless Connally makes a direct request that he do so.
The reaction around the world has been diverse and instant, as you might suspect. For example, in Moscow, TASS has been saying, it's reported, that the assassin of President Kennedy was a conservative right-winger. Now, that may or may not prove to be the truth later. However, they, as usual, are simply going on their own policies and their own attitudes of what they feel should be best in terms of their own propaganda.
Ted, yeah? we now have a report ready for Dick Robertson, who's reporting from City Hall.
Now, as though the suspect being held for the murder of a Dallas policeman is a better and better suspect all the time for the assassination of President Kennedy. Dallas police officials are still making no official comment, but information has come out from sources that obviously at this time cannot be identified, that the man is a deserter from the United States who defected to the Soviet cause at one time and has a Russian wife. And the private opinion in the Criminal Investigation Division is that this is the man, although the Dallas Police Department is still working on other leads. From police headquarters, this is Vic Robertson reporting for WFAA News.
And we have had reports that the FBI has considerable information that they are not divulging at this time, as is their custom, in order not to tip their hand in any case until it is successfully concluded. They apparently have information that they have not released to us, possibly information that would tend to indicate that this is or is not the man, but we have to await their official announcement. Ted Cassidy has been in the Communication Center newsroom almost from the start. When was the hour that you first learned of the assassination of the president?
John, I heard your bulletin delivered this morning. I can't recall the exact time.
It was slightly after the noon hour. It was about 12:40, somewhere along there. I forgot myself.
The first bulletin that you delivered. Yes, that's right. And then Travis Lynn, who was standing by at Market Hall, where the president was to speak, and then leave for Austin for the dinner, which, of course, has been canceled for tonight. Travis, naturally, was unaware that this had taken place in downtown Dallas, and following your announcement that 3 shots had been fired, and, of course, in that bulletin there was no word whether the shots had found a mark.
Yes, we didn't know at that time.
But then Travis, in his report, said that we continued to wait for him. Of course, it wasn't but a minute, or perhaps 2 minutes, before the word had spread across our communications network so that we all knew about it. My first reaction was somebody probably has been shooting a gun into the air to perhaps command attention.
Some people thought it was a firecracker and things like that. We can now have a further report from Walter Evans and Travis Lynn. If you newsmen will come in, please.
And as President of the United States at 2:39 this afternoon, and he has already departed for Washington. A White House spokesman here at Love Field said that President Johnson and as many people as could got into one compartment of Air Force One, the official presidential plane, and the swearing-in ceremony was conducted there. Mr. Johnson was sworn in as president by Judge Sarah T. Hughes, a federal judge for the Northern District of Texas, who herself was appointed by President John Kennedy when he came to office. Mrs. Hughes was crying as she conducted the swearing-in ceremony for President Lyndon Johnson. He repeated after her, "I do solemnly swear that I will perform the duties of the President of the United States to the best of my abilities and defend, protect, and preserve the Constitution of the United States." After the swearing-in ceremony, President Johnson said, "Let's get this plane to Washington." For further details, here is Walter Evans.
There was one newsman aboard the Air Force One when this swearing-in ceremony was taking place. We don't have his name at the moment. He was chosen on an instant. We understand he's a broadcast newsman from one of the Westinghouse stations up in the northern part of the country. He was given this opportunity, or this sad privilege, just because he was in the right place at the right time. He told us that Mrs. Kennedy came into the compartment where the swearing-in ceremonies took place shortly before the 2:39 p.m. swearing-in ceremonies. He said she came in without assistance. She stood on Vice President Johnson's left, and Mrs. Johnson stood on her husband's right. He said he noted that Mrs. Kennedy's hose on both legs was virtually saturated with blood. As he said there was also a quantity of blood on her dress. After the swearing-in ceremonies, Mrs. Kennedy reportedly, or rather President Johnson reportedly kissed Mrs. Kennedy and then his wife. And then he said, and these are the only words he is reportedly to have uttered after the swearing-in ceremonies, "Let's get this plane back to Washington." So it's a very solemn President Lyndon B. Johnson who now, along with the widowed Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and his wife, are now en route back to Washington aboard Air Force One.
Now here's another report from Art Sinclair, who has with him the ambulance driver involved in the operation.
Travis, this young man has a very sad story to tell, and I'm going to ask him just simply to tell it in as few words as he possibly can, and yet we want to know the full story. His name is A.L. Reich. He is with the O'Neill Mortuary here in Dallas, one of the finest ambulance and mortuaries in the city. Of course, they were at the hospital on another case at this time. A.L., what happened when you got to Parkland Hospital?
Well, we was standing by with another patient when everyone started running in and hollering for ambulance cots, our cots, to transport someone out of a car. And we stood by while they brought the president and I guess the governor and the vice president come walking in, which was when everyone then knew what had taken place. And of course, they run everyone out of the hospital if they could at the time. And then they had us stand by on the ambulance dock in case we had to transfer one of the patients to another hospital. They in turn called our funeral home for a casket after the news had been sent out that the president had expired. We then in turn took the casket back to one of the Trumbull rooms at Parkland Hospital and proceeded to load the president. But before we did, the president's wife come in, took a ring off her finger and placed it on the president's finger and kissed his hand. We then, in turn, loaded the president into his casket. I had the head where most of the blood seemed to be coming from, and it was really a terrible experience to get the blood on my hands of the President of the United States. I don't consider it a big honor or anything, but I do consider it, well, it's just hard to say how it would feel to load or touch the president, especially in that case. It's really heartbreaking to know anything about it.
All right, from Love Field, this is Art Sinclair reporting.
Repeating information on the condition of Governor John Connally, the governor's office says doctors have opened his chest and found several broken ribs and a bruised lung. The governor was shot at the same time the assassin fired the fatal bullet into President Kennedy. The doctors say that the governor's lung was collapsed by the bullet but has since been reinflated. Doctors report no serious artery damage to the governor's heart. He will be in the operating room until about 4:30 p.m. and then will undergo surgery for a leg wound. Governor Connally's pulse and blood pressure are reported all right. That last report was issued at 2:30. Incidentally, we, as far as I can recall, have not had the name of that officer who was slain on West Jefferson in the attempt to apprehend a man believed to have been the assassin or possibly connected with the assassination attempt in some way. Officer J.D. Tippett, 38 years old, was slain as he and fellow policeman M.N. McDonald ran into a rear exit of the Texas Theater. Tippett and McDonald had received a tip that the assassin of President Kennedy might have gone into that specific theater on West Jefferson. An usher told them a man in a brown shirt had entered the darkened theater a few moments before, and according to police headquarters, Tippett fired a shot. McDonald rushed the suspect. The suspect said, "It's all over now." McDonald and the suspect sprawled over a seat in the theater. McDonald's face was slashed, and police said it was a 4-inch gash. The suspect was then seized.
Something more on the building and the room where it is suspected the assassin lay in wait. Police said they found the remains of fried chicken and paper on the 5th floor.
Yeah, we had that report earlier, but there may be those who have not heard it. On the 5th floor,
indicates that the sniper apparently had been there for a while.
5th floor of a vacant warehouse near Commerce and Houston Streets.
They have a man under arrest by the name of Oswald, 5'9", weighing about 160, blonde hair, bald, dressed in ragged-looking trousers and a sports shirt.
He is the one they captured on West Jefferson, right?
The report from Rome, of course, is that there will be a good deal of attention given on the network radio and television networks. And in fact, in Great Britain, both television and radio, I think it's Great Britain, it's one of the countries of Europe, have gone off the air altogether.
Well, Ted, I heard that the video portion of their television broadcast on the BBC had been eliminated and that the audio was continuing with appropriate music. Possibly radio has gone off altogether, I'm not sure, but as far as BBC television, just the video portion has been canceled.
Here is Travis Lynn with a further report.
Plane in the presidential party is now taxiing down the end of the runway at Love Field in preparation for taking off. Vice President Johnson, Mrs. Kennedy, and the body of former President John F. Kennedy have already left Love Field. This second plane, and you may be able to hear the whine from the engines at this time, which is now taxiing to the end of the runway to take off, carries the remainder of the presidential party. Of course, the tour which had been planned has been canceled, and there will be no appearance of anyone officially in Austin. The plane bears the inscription, United States of America. It has a U.S. Air Force symbol and an American flag on the tail, and it is now leaving Love Field with the rest of the presidential party. The hearse which brought President Kennedy's body out here to the airport has now departed the airport, and it is en route back to a funeral home in Dallas. As we mentioned earlier, Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States aboard Air Force One before it departed for Washington, and after the official swearing-in ceremony conducted by a tearful Judge Sarah T. Hughes, Vice President and now President Lyndon Johnson said solemnly, "Let's get this plane to Washington." The plane took off and was gone immediately about 20 minutes ago. From Love Field, this is Travis Lynn returning you to WFAA.
We recapitulate briefly here that Vice President Johnson has been sworn in by Judge Sarah T. Hughes. He is now the official President of the United States of America, Lyndon Baines Johnson. A man has been taken into custody by authorities. His name is given as Oswald. He is about 5 feet 9, weighs approximately 160 pounds, has blonde hair, and is balding, and he was dressed in ragged-looking trousers and a sports shirt. Whether he actually is the assassin or not, we do not know at this time. The FBI is reported to have information that they are withholding, and it may be that they will release information as soon as they feel that they have the case against that man or the person they suspect of being the assassin completed.
In New York, former President Dwight Eisenhower has remarked that the assassination of President Kennedy was a despicable act. The former president said that from his suite at a hotel in New York. I quote him now, "I share the sense of shock and dismay that all Americans feel at the despicable act that resulted in the death of our nation's president. Mrs. Eisenhower and I also join with all other citizens in expressing our personal grief and prayerful concern to Mrs. Kennedy and all other members of the family." That's former President Dwight Eisenhower speaking in New York on the assassination of John Kennedy. To the knowledge of WFAA News, all civic and sporting events scheduled for this evening in Dallas have been canceled. Let me repeat that. Every civic and sporting event scheduled for this evening in Dallas have been canceled. That is the report to the best of our knowledge. Stay tuned to WFAA. We'll bring you specific details throughout the afternoon and evening. There was to be a football game between Yale and Harvard. They're now considering postponing, for at one time, the late President Kennedy was a football player at Harvard. Here is further news on the cancellation of the civic and sporting activities. The Crystal Charity Ball has been canceled due to the death of President John Kennedy. All proceeds received to this date will be given to the Children's Medical Center as a memorial to the late President Kennedy. And that's signed Mrs. Burwell J. Thompson, the chairman of the Crystal Charity Ball. There'll be a number of these announcements, we feel sure, as the day wears on. In Tyler, Bob Murdoch has surveyed the scene from the East Texas Agricultural Council. Our Farm and Ranch reporter Murray Cox was in touch with Bob only moments ago, and here's how Tyler looks at this event.
Bob, sort of unofficially around Tyler and East Texas, I know you're stunned as we are here. What's been the reaction in Tyler?
Well, of course, everyone has been in stunned disbelief. The news hit at the noon hour when people were gathered in the various restaurants and cafes. And the first news, the young secretary came in and made this announcement, and of course we smiled and said, "Oh, you're kidding." However, he said, "No, it's on the news out here on the television in the lobby," so everybody gathered there. And as I say, stood in stunned disbelief that this could have occurred. It's been quite a number of years, of course, since anything like that has happened. And naturally, everybody deplores that it has happened, and particularly that such a thing would occur in Texas.
A lot of your East Texas people are here in Dallas, of course, for this great occasion, and they'll be coming home and reporting soon.
Yes, we think it's a terrible thing, and it's just hardly believable at this time.
We understand that Morgan Beatty from NBC is giving a recapitulation of the events following the president's assassination from the NBC network, and we join the network at this time.
Older, but they do not have the means of continuity that we have. We have automatic continuity, and what happens is this. Under the law of succession to the presidency, incidentally, that law was recently amended. The vice president automatically assumes the nation's top office, as did Mr. Johnson in Dallas, and he serves out the remainder of the president's term. When he takes the oath is not a matter of importance at the moment. He automatically becomes president on the death of a president. In the event the vice president should leave office, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, at this time, Mr. McCormick of Massachusetts, takes over and also serves out the rest of the term. If there's no House Speaker, or if he fails to qualify for the presidency, you have to be a natural-born American to be president of this country. The President pro tem of the Senate assumes the office of president. Then, in the line of succession, Secretary of State, Treasury, Defense, the Attorney General, Postmaster General, Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, and Secretary of Labor. This all detailed merely to assure all persons everywhere inside and outside of our borders there is absolute continuity of government in the United States regardless of what may happen to a president. Incidentally, the Voice of America is using all of its 10 million watts in 36 languages to news and reaction to the death of the President of the United States, and his playing solemn and secular music, oftentimes hymns. Tom Perriman of Dallas, are you still on?
Yeah, because my God, he's shot. And
We're still here.
there was an
Morgan, we didn't hear your question.
I just wanted to know if you were still on. Are you interviewing an eyewitness there?
We are not at this time. We have some mobile units that are in the process of doing that, we hope.
Do you have any further information on the arrest or on any other phase of the departures?
Soon after the president was assassinated in Dallas this afternoon, a white man in his mid-20s was arrested in the Riverside section of Fort Worth in the shooting of a Dallas policeman. The man, who has black curly hair and wore a red shirt, denied that he was connected with the assassination of the chief executive. But his hands were handcuffed and he was taken to the Fort Worth City Jail. As you know, one man in Dallas was arrested at a theater after allegedly shooting a policeman, and was arrested in connection with the assassination of the president. There was thought to be a connection between the shooting of the policeman and the shooting of the president.
Now
That's the latest we have on it, Morgan. Another arrest, however, it's not known if there is a connection with the assassination.
Oh, now this means two white men are in custody.
Right. This one man was arrested in Fort Worth in connection with the shooting of a Dallas policeman.
I just wanted to make it clear to the listeners, we have reported the arrest in Fort Worth previously, but we have not indicated clearly that Oswald, the man arrested in the theater, and the man arrested in Fort Worth are two separate men, and there is a possibility then that both of them have been arrested in connection with the assassination.
That's right.
Now, since the police found signs of fried chicken and 3 empty shells on that 5th floor, and they found a foreign-made rifle, a Mauser 7.65, and they have noted indications that the man on the 5th floor had been in that building. It was empty except for workmen, as I understand it. Then we have here the developing situation that there must have been a long-planned operation here that was intended to strike the president at exactly this point. In other words, this was no sudden, shall we say, assassination without premeditation.
That's right, Morgan. What it appears here, the motorcade, which had just passed through the downtown crowd, standing 10 and 12 feet deep along each curb, broke apart in pandemonium as Secret Service agents rushed Kennedy and Connally to the hospital where he was shot. Now, Kennedy was shot at a spot where there were very few spectators, after driving almost within handshaking distance of many thousands of people. This area, ironically, there were very few people, but evidently a good eye shot from a building where the sniper was.
Good. All right, Tom, then, is there any more information about Governor Connally? The last we heard, of course, is that he's still in serious condition. They are operating on him. He's shot between the shoulder blades or just under the shoulder blades in the back. Apparently a danger there from blood internally. And also, there's indications that he might have been shot in another place, but not so seriously. Do you have any more information on his condition?
Right. We're being told right now they opened up his ribs. Roger Reddy is standing by and has just learned of the condition of the governor, so we'll turn it over to Roger Reddy. Roger?
The governor's condition, Tom, is reported serious by hospital spokesman right now. They opened up his chest and discovered 4 broken ribs and a bruised lung. The lung had collapsed, but they re-inflated it. Governor Connally received transfusions. His condition is reported, as we said, serious. However, the spokesman at the hospital said that his situation is not completely out of the woods, but that he has an excellent chance because of the fact that his pulse is good, his heartbeat is strong. There was no damage to any of the major arteries of the heart area. He was shot by a bullet that entered in his back and came out through his right chest.
Well, may I ask, I'm sorry, I'm not immediately aware of this. I believe he's a rather strong man, virile and young. What, do you either one of you know his age, Governor Connally?
Yes, his condition, general condition of health was reported good. He was strong. His age is in his favor, and his condition of health was in his favor at the time of the shooting. And the fact that he was not hit directly in the heart is going to help his chances to survive.
Well, we're glad to know that.
At our hands his age, but probably was around 45, 46, somewhere around there.
That was our impression, that he was about the age of the president, which was 46. And now, gentlemen, we have an emergency report coming in from Europe. Come in, will you please? Welshengen in Bonn, Germany.
How are you, Morgan?
Yes, Bonn.
The reaction here is, of course, as stunned as anywhere else. There's also something more. The West Germans have just ordered all their armed forces on what they call alert condition number 1. That is the highest alert short of all-out war. The reason is that they fear an aggressive Russian move in the wake of the president's assassination.
Well, certainly they are closer to the danger of war in Europe than any other nation, and always have been. And this is an understandable alert, but they do not expect any sudden decision on the part of the Russians, do they?
Well, they seem to be very fearful, Morgan. There has been no unusual activity on the border or on the Berlin Wall since the news of the president's death came in. But the West Germans are in a very awkward position. Their defense minister is now on the high seas en route to the United States, where he was due to call on the president and other American officials. And the new chancellor, Ludwig Erhard, is, as you know, on his way back from Paris. He's due just about this time at the Bonn railway station after a 2-day visit with General de Gaulle in Paris. And, of course, the West Germans are very nervous with all their leadership out of town, out of the country, and so they have ordered this alert, even though, as you say, there's no immediate cause in the sense of intelligence information to justify it.
Yes, but as we have noted before, the Russians themselves have shown a great deal of ignorance of the continuity of government of the United States, despite the fact that they know the physical aspects of it. Therefore, it is not an unwise thing to stress and emphasize that the free world and its allies are not in any way discommoded, even though we are in the midst of personal and national tragedy. Anything further to report, Wells?
Well, the former Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, who was, also retired only last month from his office and who has had certain differences with Mr. Kennedy, came up with a very warm tribute tonight. He said that the president's work will live in history, and he said Mr. Kennedy has given his life for freedom and peace. The socialist leader, the SPD, Socialist Party leader here in Bonn, has said that the event is one of the most shocking in the last decade. He is Herbert Wehner, a former communist, but now bitterly anti-communist. He leads the opposition here in Bonn. Generally, the feeling here is, I think, perhaps stronger than anywhere else in Europe because, of course, the president's visit in June made a tremendous impact in Germany, especially in Berlin, where he made his famous I Am a Berliner speech in front of the West Berlin City Hall. The people were weeping openly tonight in West Berlin and also here in West Germany. Defense Ministry employees, by the way, have been summoned from their homes, and they are now filing into the Defense Ministry, which is an old Nazi Wehrmacht barracks on the edge of Bonn, to take up night-long vigils as part of the alert condition or mobilization condition number 1 that has been ordered by the West German government.
Anything further, or are you through for the moment?
That's about it right now. The German television has canceled all its programs. They're playing simply solemn music. And in the meantime, the 400,000-man German army, which, by the way, is the largest in Europe, except for our own, is moving into mobilization positions all along the 800-mile border that separates East and West Germany. And our own troops in West Berlin and West Germany are also on an alert, although we understand it's not of the highest grade. In other words, it's not the all-out alert that has been sounded for the West German forces themselves.
Thank you, Wells Hangen, NBC News in Bonn. You may be interested to know that all radio stations throughout Western and Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe, of course, includes the satellite powers of Russia, all radio stations of Europe broadcast only funeral music after announcing the death of President Kennedy by assassination. Television stations kept up a steady flow of bulletins and canceled regular programs. Church bells tolled in many capitals. And now we have an important statement from the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate of the United States. As you know, the Senate has very peculiar powers in connection with foreign relations. Unlike the House, it has to confirm ambassadors, and it has to confirm or deny treaties that may be entered into by the United States of America. That makes it especially important that the voice of the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate be heard at a time of this kind. We switch now for a statement by Senator William Fulbright, Chairman, Foreign Relations, Senate of the United States in Washington. I'm sorry, the statement didn't come up. Senator Fulbright has, like many another senator in Washington, as Ray Shearer told us, has issued a statement, and we will carry it as soon as we can get it. But as you can all understand, that our confusion of circuits at this time is pretty difficult. We're forging our way through most of them, and we're all on duty, and will be on duty for as long as necessary to report the tragic event, the assassination of the President of the United States. Incidentally, shortly after hearing of the President's death, President Charles de Gaulle of France issued this statement: President Kennedy died as a soldier under fire, doing his duty in the service of his country. In the name of the French people, a friend always to the American people, I salute this great example and this great memory. That is a particularly important statement coming from Charles de Gaulle because of coolness of relations between the United States and France in the past year. As you will notice, the President of France went out of his way to point out the friendship of the people of France to the people of the United States. After all, they did participate in our original revolution in a very significant way, with General Lafayette, probably the outstanding military genius of that war, unless we exclude the father of our own country, George Washington. And Governor Nelson Rockefeller, an outstanding candidate for President of the United States, Republican, issued a statement. He said, "This is a shocking and terrible tragedy for the nation and the world. Mrs. Rockefeller and I join with all New Yorkers and every American in extending heartfelt sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the President's family. May God grant strength and guidance to Lyndon Johnson as he assumes his grave responsibility under these tragic circumstances. The prayers of all of us will be with him." As we have reported to you, President Johnson and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy are even now flying to Washington, where they're expected to arrive at 5:25 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And behind them, apparently behind them, because we haven't been given complete information on it, is another presidential plane bearing the body of the chief executive, who died in a hospital in Dallas, Texas, Parkman Hospital, 30 minutes after he was shot at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time today. The body is already on the way to Washington and is expected to arrive there at 6:05 p.m., and it will be taken immediately or very shortly thereafter arrival, where it will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol of the United States. Incidentally, the swearing-in scene of President Johnson, which becomes a historical scene in the long history of the United States, was very impressive, and we all await for immediate information and for the history books the scene. But it was a woman district judge who, in tears, gave him the oath of office, presumably on a Bible, because he would not affirm, he would swear on a Bible. It was in the forward compartment of a presidential plane just before the takeoff to Washington. Mrs. Johnson was president, and I believe Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, although we have not had the word. As we've told you before, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate is a particularly important man in our governmental institutions because the Senate must confirm ambassadors and confirm treaties signed and has a special duty in connection with our foreign relations, our international affairs. We take you now for a statement by Chairman Senator William Fulbright, Foreign Relations, Senate of the United States, in Washington.
The assassination of President Kennedy is a tragedy beyond words for his family, for his country, and for the world. It is an unspeakable crime. I extend my heartfelt sympathy to his family. They have lost a loved one. I have lost a friend. The American people have lost a president who has led the country with wisdom, with honor, and with dedication. In the face of so sudden a tragedy, we should be thankful we have tested institutions of government which will continue to function in an orderly manner. We are also fortunate that President Johnson is a man of long and broad experience in government. Confronted with this tragic emergency, all Americans should unite behind our new president and demonstrate the strength of our democracy to ourselves and to the world.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, for another possibly slight lifting of the curtain on the mystery surrounding the assassination of the president. We switch now once again to Dallas, Texas, to WFAA. Tom Perryman, will you come in?
Yes, we will, Morgan. Governor Connally was shot 3 times. A bullet entered his right arm, his left leg, and the back. He's reported in very, very serious condition, but not critical condition. Also, we have 2 of our newsmen at the mic right now. Both were there when the president was shot. I would like for you to hear the comments of Mel Couch and Pierce Allman. Mal, could you tell us what you saw?
Yes, I was in the 8th car in the motorcade. There were 5 other newsmen, myself, in this car. We just rounded a corner, and the president's car was heading out of downtown proper. We were at right angles to the president's car, about approximately 50 to 75 feet away. I heard this shot, or what it sounded like at the moment, to be a motorcycle backfiring, and I heard another one, and by the 3rd shot, it sounded, by then, the men in the car realized that it was not a motorcycle, but it was someone firing. Our car rounded the corner just as the president's car sped off down underneath an underpass and out onto what is known as Stemmons Expressway. I looked to the left of me as a policeman fell, pulled his pistol. To the right of me, 2 citizens dropped to the ground, and I had a chance to take a quick shot of the window from whence the assassin fired his weapon.
That was an eyewitness report from Mal Couch, WF.
That the possibility arises that the death of President Kennedy is connected with the Cold War, and fairly definitely. The police department of Dallas, Texas, reports that Lee H. Oswald, who was arrested in a theater in the outskirts of that city soon after the assassination of President Kennedy, is the prime suspect in the assassination of the president. They identify Lee H. Oswald, this black-haired, curly black-haired man in his 20s, as a chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee. Now, in that connection, It is interesting to note what the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is in the United States, or the various committees that were formed in universities primarily a couple of years ago. I happen to have reported the Fair Play for Cuba Committee formation. This committee was originally formed with $5,000 traced directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation from the hands of the Foreign Minister of Cuba, Raul, to an American, and it was intended to build a backfire against the government of the United States here. Now, this does not indict all Fair Play for Cuba committees, but the fact is that Fidel Castro was the father of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee idea in the United States, and the proof is complete and absolute from beginning to end. So we repeat the bulletin just received from Dallas, Texas. Lee H. Oswald, a young man in his 20s, black curly hair, was arrested in the theater in Dallas as the prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. He scuffled with the police. He wounded one of the police, and when he was finally subdued after a pistol was taken away from him, he said, well, it's all over now. So all of the evidence points to the fact that the police of Dallas are on the track of a very tragic connection involving the death of the President of the United States. There was a slight further detail on that point. Oswald worked in the building from which the shots were fired at the President. His supervisor said he was there at noon. That was a warehouse about 8 stories high. The shot was fired from a 5th or a 6th-story window. That has not been definitely determined yet. And there were workmen in the building refurbishing it for some reason or another. There were no tenants at the time in the building. So Oswald was a worker in this building, and he had been there at noon, was seen there by his supervisor at that time. The man's name is Lee H. Oswald. He's been identified as a chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee. And the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was formed with money, dollars, supplied directly by Fidel Castro through his foreign minister, who was then in the United Nations about 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. And we now have what at least is an indirect connection with the situation. As we've reported to you, maybe we have more detail on this now. Let's take a try for it. We switch once again to Dallas, Texas, WAFAA. Tom Parrigan.
A man has been arrested, Lee Oswald, a 24-year-old man who said 2 years ago he wanted Russian citizenship, is being questioned to see whether he had any connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. Under questioning now by police, reliable sources indicate he's the man, according to the questions that have been asked and the way he has answered them. The rifle that was used to kill the president has been picked up by police. Ballistics tests are being undertaken at this time. Oswald was an Oak Cliff, Dallas man, Oak Cliff, a section of Dallas, and he's undergoing questioning now, and sources that we have talked to indicate that he is the man. That's the latest story from here, Morgan.
Thank you very much, Tom. Right alert and on the job. Just as we get the official bulletin from the Police Department of Dallas, we have confirmation that this man had asked for Russian citizenship. I believe you said as recently as 2 years ago. We have a statement now from Ambassador Adlai Stevenson of the United Nations. Stevenson, as you may remember, in the convention in 1960, was the man who made the most direct assault on the candidacy of a rival, and that rival was John Kennedy. Ambassador Stevenson later turned to serve the administration he had tried to prevent from taking office, but of course well within party politics. The ambassador made this statement this afternoon. The tragedy of this day is beyond instant comprehension. All of us who knew him will bear the grief of his death to the day of our death, and all men everywhere who love peace and justice and freedom will bow their heads. At such a moment, we can only turn to prayer. prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. Kennedy's family, to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in time to come. Apparently, we now can clear up a point about the party, the White House party, traveling from Dallas, Texas, where the president died at 1 p.m. Central Time, to Washington, D.C., where the body will be lying in state temporarily in the White House. The word is, apparently, that the entire party, President Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, are on the same Air Force plane. It will arrive in Andrews Field Air Force Base areas about 6:05 p.m. and will be driven, and all of the party will be driven immediately to the White House and is expected to arrive there at 6:30. President Johnson will leave the White House jet and take a helicopter to the White House. President Kennedy's body will be taken to the Bethesda Naval Hospital, method of transport not now known. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy is believed to be aboard the plane as well. Reports from Dallas indicate that she is. The Kennedy children have not, and we repeat this, the Kennedy children have not been notified of their father's death. They're in the White House with Miss Maud Shaw. Miss Maud Shaw is their nurse. Sergeant Shriver, the late president's brother-in-law, is with them. And from other reports we have had from the White House, it does appear that the sad duty of notifying Caroline, who observes her 6th birthday next Wednesday, and her brother John, who observes his 3rd birthday on Monday, the sad duty of notifying them of the death of their father is being left to Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, who will arrive in the White House in about an hour and a half from now. And now we have more detail on the arrest of the prime suspect in the assassination of President John Kennedy. We return to a conversation with Tom Perriman, station WFAA in Dallas, Texas. Will you come in, Tom?
Morgan, federal officers have been going over the man very closely for a considerable period of time now. The witnesses to the president's assassination are in the next room at police headquarters, but they have not yet looked at the man. As we told you, the rifle used for the president's assassination has been recovered and is undergoing fingerprint analysis at this time. Now, the report to us is now that Oswald was picked up in New Orleans not long ago and fined $10 for distributing communist literature. That's the latest story on Oswald. He has not been charged yet, but is undergoing rigid interrogation at Dallas Police Headquarters.
Well, it is significant that the police and the federal authorities are taking their time. They're giving us identifications of this man as at least a fellow traveler, probably a communist. He is identified by the police as a chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee, a group formed directly by money furnished by Fidel Castro through his foreign ministry, and now we learn additional detail of a communist-type background. Some time ago, we reported that Pope Paul was indicting a statement concerning the death of President Kennedy. It is significant that the Pope is personally writing this statement. He's taken a great deal of time before finishing it. He wishes to say something, apparently, directly to the American people. We take you again to Irving R. Levine in Rome.
Pope Paul VI has just sent this message to the American people. We are profoundly stricken by the tragic and sad news of the assassination of the President of the United States of America, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and of the grave wounding of Governor Connally. We are profoundly saddened by such a shocking crime, by the mourning which strikes through its leader, a great and civilized country, by the sorrow which afflicts Mrs. Kennedy, her children, and all her relatives. Pope Paul's message continued. We deplore with all our heart this event. We express the hope that the death of this great statesman will not bring damage to the American people, but will reinforce their moral and civil sense and strengthen their sentiments of nobility and of peace. And we pray to God that the sacrifice of John Kennedy will aid the cause promoted by him for the defense of the liberty of peoples and of peace in the world. The Pope's message goes on. He was the first Catholic president of the United States. We remember to have had the honor of his visit and to have found in him great wisdom and high ideals for the welfare of humanity. Tomorrow we will offer a holy mass for the peace of his soul, for the comfort of those who mourn his death, and so that not hatred but love will reign among the human race. That's the message to the American people from Pope Paul VI.
A most impressive message, and a footnote, that Pope Paul waited, composed his own personal statement concerning the death of President Kennedy.
This is WFAA, Clear Channel, 820 Dallas.
We have an extended report on a former president's statement about the death of the chief executive of our nation. We read you before, briefly, the first statement issued by former President Dwight Eisenhower, who stressed in his original statement our nationhood and the presidency itself. And now we have an opportunity for an extended statement from President Eisenhower.
I share the sense of shock and dismay that the entire nation must feel at the despicable act that took the life of the nation's president. On the personal side, Mrs. Eisenhower and I share the grief that Mrs. Kennedy must now feel. And we send to her our prayerful thoughts and sympathetic sentiments in this hour.
General, how would you counsel the American people at this time?
In the face of such a terrible thing, I'm sure the entire citizenry of the nation will join as one man in expressing not only their grief but their indignation at this act, and will stand faithfully behind the government.
General, could you tell us how you got the word?
I was at a meeting for the United Nations, and while there, a member of the meeting was called out and came back and told us the news. Although at that time, we did not know the president was dead. We did not know when I got back here at that time that he was dead. But, matter of fact, we had the last message we had was one rather of hope. And the entire company merely paused for a minute at the request of the chairman, and each of us, in his own way, said a silent prayer for the president.
Should there be any concern, sir, over national security at a time like this?
No, I think the whole nation now would be almost all of us security agents.
General, will the nation be all right in the few months ahead?
Oh, I'm not going to predict anything of that. I just say this. The American nation is a people of great common sense, and they are not going to be stampeded or bewildered.
Thank you, Mr. President. History have assassinations affected the political course of events?
Well, of course, in Lincoln's assassination, the presidency went to a man who was a registered Democrat, Mr. Johnson. In Garfield, I doubt that there was any. And, of course, McKinley, that brought in Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, there have been other attempts in late years. Mr. Truman was at a grave threat to his life, and Mr. Roosevelt, just before he was inaugurated, you remember, down when Mayor Cermak was killed, ran a very grave risk. These things have happened, and it seems inexplicable to me, because Americans are loyal. And it's just this occasional psychopathic sort of accident that occurs, and I don't know what we can do about it.
Could you say anything, General, about how people will feel abroad from all your experience with the United Nations and others? How will it be taken abroad?
Well, I think they will be a bit bewildered. This, in the civilized countries of the world, this doesn't happen so often. And you remember in the starting of World War I, the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand, I think his name was. Why, this itself almost, one of the contributory causes to that war. And, but here, I just don't know what happens. But we are a nation that where our freedoms are allowed, or are observed in such a way that everybody is ready everybody is, you might say, capable of doing this if he's ready to put his own life on the line.
General, how will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow? How will you spend the rest of today and then tomorrow and then the weekend?
I have canceled the dinner date that I had for tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going immediately to my home, and if I'm wanted for any purpose whatsoever, I will, of course, be available.
Would you have any advice for the American people at this time, General?
No, as I said, I know the American people will stand solid, and they will not be stampeded.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Right. Thank you very much. Good night, fellows.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have further reports on the cabinet officers, the 6 officers of the government who were away when President Kennedy was assassinated. Bill Roddy, NBC News San Francisco, reports that Secretary of State Dean Rusk and a party of 5 other cabinet officers have left Honolulu for the nonstop flight to Washington. As you may remember, they were on their way to Tokyo from Honolulu when they got the word aboard their plane, and they ordered it to return to Honolulu. They have now refueled, and they're on their way nonstop all the way to Washington, apparently with no stop on the way, such as San Francisco. Their military jet is expected to land at Andrews Air Force Base at 12:29 a.m. on Saturday morning. An Air Force official in Honolulu told Roddy by telephone a few minutes ago that the sequence of events that brought the cabinet officers back to Hawaii was about like this. They left for Tokyo as scheduled at 7:03 Honolulu time. This morning at 8:37, they received word that the president had been wounded in a bulletin from a press association. They had no further confirmation. They continued their journey. At 9 a.m., it was decided to return to Honolulu. At 9:33, they received word that the president had died, and Secretary of State Rusk got the plane public address system going to announce the sad news to the other cabinet officials. Mr. Rusk, along with Secretary Dillon of the Treasury, Douglas Dillon, and Udall, and Freeman, and Hodges, and Wirtz, issued the following statement. We are deeply shocked by this grievous tragedy which has removed a great and beloved leader of our country and of the world quest for peace. Our hearts are with Mrs. Kennedy and her family at this time of sorrow, and we renew our dedication. Our prayers go with President Johnson as he assumes the high responsibility of the presidency. And now for the rest of the story of reaction in Vatican City. We return to Irving R. Levine in Rome.
A book of condolences has been opened at the American Embassy here in Rome. Although it is now almost 11:30 at night, about 150 people are lined up at the embassy to sign and thereby to indicate their sympathy with the Kennedy family and the American government. The Church of Santa Susana, the American Catholic Church in Rome, has announced that tomorrow afternoon, Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York will celebrate Requiem Mass in honor of the President. Flags will fly at half-mast here in Italy for 3 days. This has just been ordered by Italian President Antonio Segni. And at 5 minutes past midnight, Rome time, in about 3/4 of an hour from now, the Italians will have an opportunity to see something of this American tragedy via a satellite feed of film from the United States. This is Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Rome.
The connection of the president's assassination, at least its potential connection with the Cold War, is being stressed in various parts of the world. As we have heard from Bonn, Germany, the number one alert is up for the military services of that country. That's next to the alert for war, because they're in close contact with the eastern satellite nations, and they do not expect any trouble, but this kind of alert is normal in this kind of situation. And now we have word from Laredo, Texas. A bulletin. The Mexican government officially announces through its Laredo offices that it has sealed the Texas-Mexican border for 72 hours against the passage of any person who may wish to pass. That might be an indication that it is generally suspected that the plot extends beyond the young man Oswald, who was arrested in Dallas and who has now been connected with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in the United States, and who is reported to have asked or have boasted that he would like to be a citizen of Russia. This young man is being intensively questioned in the Dallas Police Headquarters at this time. The witnesses to the assassination who could possibly identify him have not seen him yet. His fingerprint record is being checked out. The police, all federal authorities, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Secret Service, are all moving extremely carefully to be sure that they're making no mistake in their haste to solve the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time today. And now we would like to give you more detail on the Kennedy children. As we've told you before, Caroline and John, Caroline 6, John 3, were at the White House when their father was killed. Sergeant Shriver, brother-in-law of the president, husband of Eunice Shriver, the president's sister, and Eunice went to the White House immediately. They saw that the children were in the good care of Maud Shaw, an old family friend, and then they immediately went to Hyannisport or Boston to be with Joseph Kennedy, the president's father, and Mrs. Kennedy. But Mr. Shriver apparently is in charge of funeral arrangements because the military is clearing through him the details. Meanwhile, the two children are at the White House. Mr. Shriver did not tell the children that their father was dead, even though he knew it when he visited them at the White House. Apparently, no one else has told the children of the death of their father. One reason is that great birthday plans had been underway for the 6th birthday next Wednesday for Carolyn, and the 3rd birthday on Monday for John. Next week was to have been a big week for the first family. There had been lots of fun and party plans underway for the two children to celebrate John's birthday actually on Monday, November the 25th, but they were going to celebrate on Tuesday because his playmates could be at the White House at that time. Party plans were also ready for Caroline on Wednesday. Caroline was to be the star at a big family birthday gathering with all her cousins at Cape Cod in Massachusetts. All of the Kennedys were to have been together for their traditional Thanksgiving gathering at Hyannisport on Thursday. And now, for the sad prospect of arrival of the party from Dallas to Washington, that's the presidential party, including President Lyndon Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, and the body of President Kennedy. They had left Dallas early in the afternoon. They're expected in Washington at 5:30. Now we take you for more detail on the arrival to Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.
President Kennedy's body will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House tomorrow for 8 hours. The term lie in repose indicates a private funeral arrangement. He will later lie in state in the Capitol building. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, who arrives in Washington in something like 45 minutes from now, will proceed immediately from Andrews Air Force Base in nearby Maryland to the White House, where he'll go into a meeting with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, who is President Kennedy's advisor on national security matters. At 8 o'clock this evening, President Johnson will meet with the bipartisan leadership of the Congress. While President Kennedy's body lies in repose in the East Room of the White House tomorrow, his family will view him first, beginning at 10 o'clock in the morning. They will be followed by President Johnson, by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John McCormick, former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, and members of the executive branch of the government who hold presidential appointments. In the afternoon, members of the Supreme Court and members of the federal judiciary will also view President Kennedy's body. At 2:30, members of the Senate, members of the House, and the governors of the 50 states and territories. And at 5 o'clock, members of the diplomatic corps will view the body of President Kennedy in the East Room of the White House. President Johnson will make his first statement as President of the United States when he lands at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, approximately 40 minutes from now. This is Robert Goralski, NBC News, reporting from the White House.
Robert Goralski, will you hang on a moment there? We now have from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue the report that President Johnson will meet at the White House tonight with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and the White House National Security aide, George Bundy, and then he will confer with the bipartisan leadership of Congress. I didn't catch whether you covered that part of it or not. It seems to be very important all around the world now that we know the possible nature of the assassination of the president, possibly a plot not by the communist world itself, but by one of its misguided followers. It is important that the continuity of government and the national defense be stressed at this time. That's one reason why 6 cabinet members are flying back, who were on the way to Tokyo, flying back to Washington, and will arrive early tomorrow morning. And now we understand that we have more detail on the possible solution of the assassination of President Kennedy. Let's go again to WFAA in Dallas, to Tom Perryman. Will you come in, Tom?
The report we have right now is that Governor Connally, also shot, is reported in satisfactory condition. Dr. Robert Shaw says he'll have to stay in the hospital at least 2 weeks. Also, we have an eyewitness report to the shooting, and would like for you to hear that now.
I am L.J. Lewis, 500 East Jefferson Avenue in Oak Cliff. And we were sitting in the office here, and we heard the shots. And I just casually made a remark. I said, I bet they have him cornered. And so I looked up the street and saw the suspect coming down the street, and he was reloading his revolver and stuck it in his belt when he got, just across the street from us. And he turned and went up the street, and I immediately phoned the police, and one of the boys here in the office, Warren Reynolds, and Pat Patterson, they followed the suspect up the street before he turned behind the service station and to the alley. I immediately phoned the police, and Warren and Pat Patterson, followed the suspect on up the street. And after that, it's just matter of time, till all the police and everything were around here.
That was the voice of L.J. Lewis, an eyewitness to the assassination of President Kennedy. We have some reaction here to the shooting, and would like to call in Roger Reddy here at WFAA for that report.
A salesman traveling on the road called the newsroom at WFAA and made mention of the fact that as he heard the information of President Kennedy's death on the radio while traveling through Waco, north through Texas on the highways, he noticed that all along the way, truck drivers were pulled off to the side of the road and in parking areas, and they were openly weeping and sobbing. Passengers in cars had pulled off to the road and were talking quietly in a numbed manner. Also, some were weeping. The entire scene on the Texas highways reflected the sadness of President Kennedy's demise. All social and civic functions have been canceled in the Dallas area for the weekend, too. Dallas schools, however, did remain in session.
Thank you, Roger Reddy. One final note, Morgan. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy at Parkland Hospital took her ring off and put it on John F. Kennedy's hand. She lifted the president's hand and kissed it. One final note. That's the story from Dallas, Morgan Beatty.
Thank you, Tom. And now, for those who may just have tuned in, this report is continuous on the assassination of President Kennedy at 12:30 p.m. At least he was shot at that moment, and his death at 1 p.m. in Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas.
We pause 10 seconds for station identification.
This is Clear Channel 820 Radio, the sound of the Southwest, WFAA Dallas.
An interesting note from Washington. Senate Minority Leader Everett M. Dirksen, the Illinois Republican, said this afternoon that Senate leaders had met and decided not to go to Andrews Air Force Base to meet the presidential party. It's due to arrive, as you've heard, at 6:05 p.m., and the president's body will be taken immediately to arrive at the White House at 6:30. Senator Dirksen said this: "We felt this would be an intrusion at the time when grief and shock is so intense. Normally, when the president returns to Andrews Air Force Base, an honor guard of 16 men is there to meet him. Tonight, the number was doubled to 32, plus 6 to stand by to act as pallbearers as needed. All of the 38 are from Air Force Honor Guard. Air Base officials report they understand Secret Service men probably would act as pallbearers on the arrival of the president's body about 36 minutes from now." Wilson Hall reports from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, that the switchboard at the American embassy there is jammed with calls from Brazilians who either cannot believe President Kennedy is dead or those who do believe it and offer condolences. People going home from work, you know they're 3 hours ahead of New York time, are stopping at the American embassy to ask if the news could be true. A crowd of Brazilians is outside the embassy waiting for further word and the reason why the assassination. Already, as you know, we're getting word that it may be a part of the Cold War, a fanatical wing of Fidel Castro's Fair Play for Cuba group. A man who has said he wishes to be a Russian citizen is being detained by the Dallas police. They have reported they are questioning him intensely. They are not yet giving the witnesses to the assassination a chance to see the man until they get through completely with their interrogation. Incidentally, as we've told you, President Charles de Gaulle of France has issued a statement that stresses very specifically the friendship of France for the people of the United States and its government. That's because there's been a cooling in recent months of relations between France and the United States. Now President de Gaulle has sent a personal message to Mrs. Kennedy. It says this: "The immense sorrow which has stricken you moves my wife and me from the bottom of our hearts. Please accept our assurance that we are with you in thought and in prayer. President Kennedy will never be forgotten." Senator Dirksen, as we've noted, has acted as a spokesman for the Senate leadership at this moment. We can now take you to Washington for a statement from the senator in his own voice. Senator Dirksen in Washington.
Well, it's so incredible that in a free country where people can so freely utter their opinions about anybody in public life and in the parlance of the day get it off their chest, that anyone could have such a congealed hate in his heart, or that he could have such a convulsive mind as to commit this kind of a heinous crime. When it happens in a country that's oppressed and under the iron heel of a dictator, where people are impoverished and all their liberties are destroyed, one can readily understand, I think, that sometime the restraints will burst and an untoward event will take place. But is there any conceivable excuse in the hardest of hearts for this kind of an act? And its impact will be enormous, not only on the country, but on the whole wide world.
A statement by Senator Dirksen of Illinois, the minority leader of the Senate, who has also announced that Senate leaders will not intrude at Andrews Air Force Base near Washington when the body arrives about 6:05 p.m. The party is on the way now. You may recall we reported that President Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office aboard a presidential plane just before the takeoff for Washington. Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes of Dallas administered the brief oath of office to the Vice President. He looked very grim, and he turned, as soon as the oath had been administered, he embraced Mrs. Johnson, who's known in Washington as Lady Bird, and he embraced Mrs. Kennedy. Between 25 and 30 persons witnessed the swearing in the front compartment of a presidential plane. I believe it's Air Force Number 1 is the name of the plane where the swearing-in took place. The witnesses included Mrs. Evelyn Lincoln, Kennedy's personal secretary. After the president embraced his wife and Mrs. Kennedy, he turned to an Air Force officer nearby and said, "Okay, let's get this plane back to Washington."
WFAA newsman Bob Thornton at Parkland Hospital talked to Dr. Robert Shaw, who released this statement of condition on Texas Governor John Connally.
The press room here at Parkland Hospital. Dr. Robert Shaw, who is a member of the Parkland Hospital staff, is one of the physicians. We have yet to learn the other doctor's name. Both of them have been in the emergency ward here at Parkland Hospital, attending Governor John Connally. Apparently he is out of surgery now and most likely is in one of the recovery rooms here in Parkland Hospital. Dr. Shaw is about to speak. He's professor of surgery at the Southwestern Medical School here in Dallas, who is going to give a statement and ask questions. He has been introduced by the other physician who did not identify himself. He's professor of thoracic surgery at the Southwest Medical School. Dr. Shaw appears to be about 50 years old. There are TV cameras from most of the stations here in Dallas. Dr. Shaw is introducing himself. He said, because of this position as professor of the medical school, I accepted the responsibility of caring for Dr. Connally. Now a long pause while some technical adjustments are made on the newsreel cameras here in the press room. They are requesting that he start over again. About 4 dozen reporters are gathered around. Dr. Shaw is starting once more. Because of his position, he said he accepted the responsibility of caring for Governor Connally following his injury. I want to say at the outset, the condition of the governor is quite satisfactory in view of the injury he has sustained. He seemed to have been struck by just one bullet, which entered the right posterior chest, close to the shoulder blade, and coursed downward along the chest wall, taking out and fragmenting a portion of the fifth rib on the right. The bullet then emerged from the chest, evidently struck his right wrist, fracturing the lower part of the right radius, and entered the left side where it was spent. The thigh wound is trivial. The fracture of the radius should heal without difficulty or without further disability. Our major problem was a sucking wound of the right chest wall, because in making the wound of the chest, fragments of the fifth rib became what we referred to as secondary missiles, and these caused a considerable amount of tissue damage. And the point where the missile emerged from the chest. When the wound had been enlarged in order to remove damaged tissue, The lung was inspected. It was found there was a tear, which had to be repaired. There was also a small hole due to a small rib fragment. This was of no consequence. The major problem was a matter of completely controlling all bleeding points, removing all damaged muscle and tissue, and then securing a tight closure of the chest wall so the lung could be re-expanded. The governor's condition was good. He was perfectly lucid before anesthesia was started. And from what we know about his injury, we have no reason to believe that he cannot recover.
Dr. Shaw went on to say that Governor Connally will remain in Parkland Hospital for the next 14 to 15 days. That was Bob Thornton reporting from Parkland Hospital here in Dallas. Now, WFAA Farm and Ranch Director Murray Cox talked a few moments ago to Jay Norman, president of the Texas Farmers Union in Lubbock, and here was that interview.
Jay, the news, of course, has saddened everybody. How about the Texas Farmers Union people in convention out there at Lubbock?
Well, Murray, this terrible tragedy has certainly grieved our convention. We in Farmers Union feel that the farmers of Texas and America have lost a great friend in the death of President Kennedy. We have canceled our convention activities for the remainder of the day, and we've canceled our banquet session. We are going to convene the delegates on Saturday for the adoption of the program and the election of the delegates to the National Convention. But there will be no other business conducted.
Murray Cox talking to Jay Norman, president of the Texas Farmers Union in Lubbock, Texas, and the Farmers Union's reaction to the presidential assassination. Now we rejoin Morgan Beatty, anchorman from the NBC radio network.
Died from the bullet that hit him. And as we reported before, Oswald put up a fight. He was subdued as a crowd of 600 people gathered outside the Texas Theater. That's the name of the theater, a suburban theater in the Oak Cliff district of Texas. Oswald accused the police of brutality. Cry Battle and War is Hell. Incidentally, Cry Battle and War is Hell were the names of the two films playing in the theater where the man had sought refuge. From Washington, Robert McCormick reports that the body of the president will lie in repose tomorrow at the White House, not in state. The body will lie in repose. There is a difference between a body lying in state and one lying in repose. When a body lies in repose, it is in private. The president's body will lie in state at the rotunda of the Capitol later. As we've noted to you, we've had the two sort of intermixed, and we'd like to clarify the point that the body will lie in the White House in repose, meaning that this is the private mourning period for the first family of the nation. Under dateline of Moscow, Saturday morning, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko telephoned United States Ambassador Foy D. Kohler at midnight at the embassy residence Spaso House. Mr. Gromyko expressed his shock and the greatest sympathy to the American people. Official condolences will be conveyed later at the highest level, he told the ambassador. This presumably meant that Premier Khrushchev, who's been reported on vacation, by the way, in the last few days on the Black Sea, that Premier Khrushchev will either return to Moscow or in other ways make known the sincere grief of the Russian government at the death of President Kennedy. And from London, Sir Winston Churchill said tonight the assassination of President Kennedy is a monstrous act which has taken from us a great statesman and a wise and a valiant man. The World War II leader, will be 89 on November the 30th. He issued a statement from his London residence after listening to BBC television accounts of the president's death and the radio. The loss to the United States, said Sir Winston, and to the world is incalculable. Those who come after Mr. Kennedy must strive the more to achieve the ideals of world peace and human happiness and dignity to which his presidency was dedicated. A spokesman for Sir Winston said he and Lady Churchill sat up past 10 p.m., that is British time, to keep in touch with developments on television. I so well remember Sir Winston's statement at the death of President Roosevelt. He said his was an enviable death, meaning that it had come at the apex of his career. And he spoke almost as if he himself had wished that he could die at the apex of success at the end of World War II. In this case, of course, you have a much younger statesman, and Sir Winston's reaction was entirely different. This monstrous act, he said, has taken from us a great statesman and a wise and valiant man. The civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King, is reported to be in a state of shock at the news of President Kennedy's death. NBC News obtained from him, however, a statement. I am shocked and grief-stricken at the tragic assassination of President Kennedy, said Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a great and dedicated president. His death is a great loss to America and to the world.
This is Clear Channel Station WFAA 820 Dallas.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have word from London that very shortly we'll have a statement from the new Prime Minister of Britain, a man we customarily call Lord Hume, and I'm sorry if I call him that now. He has renounced his title. We have a statement from Rabbi Israel Moskowitz, the president of the New York Board of Rabbis. He says all Americans, regardless of race or creed or political affiliation, are joined in profound grief and sorrow at the tragic death of our great and beloved President John F. Kennedy. The assassin's bullet will all the more firmly enshrine him in the hearts and history of a grateful country, which is the beneficiary of his many inspired acts of statesmanship and devotion to our country and to the cause of world peace. The New York Board of Rabbis, says Rabbi Moskowitz, calls on all synagogues in our community to hold services of tribute to his blessed life and memory. May this tragic hour for America and the world cause all of us to rededicate ourselves anew with greater vigor to the democratic ideals of our blessed land, to which President Kennedy gave such magnificent leadership. It is significant that the tone of that message follows exactly the tone of the message left with us by former President Dwight Eisenhower, who spoke of our national loss, who spoke of the importance of the presidency and our gathering together, our coming together behind a tragic event of this kind. Incidentally, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who steps from an airplane at Andrews Air Force Base in a very few minutes, is a man of tremendous energy. He's 6'3", 200 pounds. He was born on August the 27th, 1908, near Johnson City, Texas. His grandfather had said of him at that time, he'll be a United States Senator someday. His grandfather could never have known, of course, that he would miss the mark, but his first estimate was fair. The new chief executive first entered political life in December 1931, secretary to Representative Richard M. Clayburgh of Texas. 6 years later, Mr. Johnson himself was elected to the 75th Congress, the victor over 10 opponents in a special election. The former President Franklin Roosevelt personally encouraged Johnson to run for the Senate because at the time that happened, in 1941, the incumbent in office, Morris Shepherd, had died. Johnson lost by a slim margin but retained his seat in the House. On December the 8th, 1941, the day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the lanky Texas congressman, a lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve, became the first member of Congress to enter active military service. He was awarded a Silver Star for gallantry on bombing missions in the South Pacific before leaving the service in 8 months after a presidential order exempting national legislators from military duty. That order, incidentally, almost ordered legislators to remain at their desks in Washington. In 1948 it was that the prophecy of Johnson's grandfather came true. He was elected to the Senate by an 87 margin vote, only by that margin. And incidentally, probably the most profound political impression that Johnson has after many years in office is that politics is the science of the possible. He has changed the old adage that politics is the art of the possible. He has sometimes been called a compromiser, but he is a very diligent compromiser to have his own way. And now across the Atlantic again, ladies and gentlemen, to the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Sir Alec Douglas Hume in London.
A man who believed that all men were equal in the sight of God and acted on that belief. And then a man who, as a husband and a father, was tolerant and human, and as a politician, was a statesman who grasped all the opportunities that he had and looked forward with an imagination rare in a man of his years. In 3 short years of his presidency, he left an indelible mark on his country and on the world. And for us in Britain, his loss is a deep and a sad one. Because he was the most loyal and faithful of allies. Tonight, I fear, there is no comfort that I can bring to the American people, nor indeed to ourselves, nor indeed to men anywhere who care for tolerance and liberty and justice and peace, unless it be this, that this dreadful deed should shock us all to dedicate ourselves anew to those things which he liked, which he loved, and for which he worked during his life. And if we can help to bring to men the liberty, justice, and peace for which he did so much, then we shall be doing something to serve the causes in the service of which he himself died.
Now, waiting in our Manchester studio is Mr. Harold Wilson, the Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister, I think, spoke for all of us when he expressed the deep sympathy of this nation, of our people, to Mrs. Kennedy, her family, to his relatives and his associates in the American government on this tragic, this senseless act that has taken place today. It has come as a tremendous shock to everyone in this country. When I heard the news, I was addressing a large meeting, and when it was announced, all the people in the hall let out an involuntary gasp of horror. And as they stood in sympathy, in tribute to President Kennedy, one could sense that they were almost stunned by what they had heard.
A report from the Prime Minister of Great Britain and his associates on the death of President Kennedy. The plane bearing the body of the president was exactly on time at Andrews Air Force Base near Washington. Aboard were President Lyndon Johnson, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, and Mrs. Johnson. We take you immediately to Bryson Resch at Andrews Air Force Base near Washington.
Andrews Air Base, are you working? Andrews Air Base.
I'm sorry, our circuits got twisted there. We've just learned that the plane bearing the president's body was on time. As a matter of fact, it was a little ahead of time, riding the jet current. It arrived at 5:58 p.m. That was about 6 minutes ahead of time. And to cover the story for NBC Radio News, we take you at once to Bryson Resch at Andrews Air Force Base.
Out of that carrier that has just brought down the casket.
I'm sorry, we're at Andrews Air Force Base, where those who've arrived are greeting those who are there to greet them. Bryson Resch is standing by. The sounds you hear are the sounds that surround the arrival of the plane and the automobiles.
It was a very steep step that she had to jump down to get on the floor. Aides helped her do it. She was helped also by her brother-in-law, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
That's the voice of Nancy Dickerson, NBC News, Washington.
Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson are standing just near the door in the rear of the presidential jet, waiting.
Mrs. Lyndon Johnson is holding the new president's hand.
And the Navy ambulance moves off with the casket.
The ambulance is going to the other side of this airport. It is supposed to deliver the casket to the helicopters that are standing by.
The ambulance moving past the guard of honor, a cordon of soldiers, airmen lining the field here, and behind them thousands of young airmen from Andrews Air Force Base who have come here up to the fence to see.
The Secret Service man comes down the steps of the airplane. Now, new President Lyndon Baines Johnson with his wife, Lady Bird. They're coming down the steps. They are followed by Johnson aides, including Mrs. Carpenter, Mr. Bill Moyers, former Congressman Homer Thornberry,
It's the head of the Secret Service on the president's right. Secretary McNamara and other officials greeting the new president. As he moves...
affectionately kissed Mrs. Johnson.
President Johnson's statement, which he will be giving to the public in a very short time, has been handed to reporters, the one he wrote aboard the airplane on his way back to Washington. President Johnson, in the statement, first public statement as Chief Executive of the United States, today promised the nation to do his best in new and grave responsibility. He asked divine guidance in the task.
Baines Johnson, who has been the Chief Executive of the United States for a few hours only after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, has now advanced to a bank of microphones set up beside the plane, where he has just arrived from Dallas, Texas. He is standing there and will make his first statement as the new President of the United States. Beside him is Mrs. Johnson. They are standing soberly, quietly. He looks about him. The body of the slain president has departed Andrews Air Force Base just outside Washington. Mrs. Kennedy rode with the body of her husband to the White House. Vice President Johnson.
For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
The new President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Mrs. Johnson, started to walk to the helicopter, and then the head of the Secret Service, Mr. James Rowley, brought him back to shake hands with the great number of dignitaries who have come here to pay their respect to the slain president and to greet the new President of the United States. In the crowd, shaking hands with the new President Johnson, is Mike Mansfield, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, the Republican Leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois. Senator Aiken of Vermont is also in the crowd. Speaker John McCormick was here just a moment ago and is in the large group of people that have now clustered about President Johnson. The tall Texan stands out because of his height from those around him. He shakes hands with W. Averill Harriman, the Undersecretary of State. Shortly after the death of President Kennedy this afternoon, the acting Secretary of State, George Ball, notified all of the governors of the United States, all of the heads of missions of the diplomatic corps in Washington, and all the consular missions overseas, as well as the U.S. diplomatic missions overseas. Here at the airport, there are a great number of diplomats have gathered to pay their respects to the late President Kennedy and to greet President Lyndon Johnson. Among them, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Ambassador Sevilla Sacasa of Nicaragua, and the Ambassador of Iran. I have not yet seen the Ambassador of the Soviet Union. He is probably here in the crowd. President Johnson breaks from the knot of people and walks to the helicopter that is prepared to take him into the city proper. He again stops for a moment to chat with the former Chief of Naval Operations, Ali Burton, and chat also with one of Mr. Kennedy's top advisors, Mr. McGeorge Bundy. Later this evening, the new president will meet with Mr. Bundy and with Secretary of Defense McNamara at the White House. President Kennedy approaches the helicopter, and with him, Mrs. Johnson. They go aboard now, and in a moment, the helicopter will take off and whisk them to the White House. Going aboard with them, Undersecretary or Acting Secretary of State George Ball, Secretary of Defense McNamara, and others. The U.S. Air Force plane, the big jet, landed shortly after 6 p.m., bearing the body of slain President Kennedy to Washington. The large forklift covered